The Nintendo Switch 2 is finally here, but it's expensive and pretty hard to find. So, is the Nintendo Switch 1 still a good way to go, and is it still worth it in 2025? Let's find out. Nintendo Switch 1 first launched all the way back in 2017, and since then, almost a decade ago at this point, we've had a lot of iterations that have slowly but surely made the console better overall. For example, the Nintendo Switch OLED, which launched back in 2021. This was arguably the biggest improvement ever made on the Nintendo Switch. It gave you a much bigger and OLED display, plus it gave you double the storage that you had in the system. And while they didn't increase the power from the Nintendo Switch to the Nintendo Switch OLED, and while yes, the power of the Nintendo Switch in general kind of pales in comparison to any other modern handheld gaming console, it was still a very usable system because all of the games were specifically optimized for it. In fact, to this day, you can play modern Nintendo games on this handheld with no issues whatsoever. It's a very smooth experience, and presumably Nintendo will continue to support this console for years to come. But of course, we now have the new kid on the block. We've got the Nintendo Switch 2, Nintendo's next generation Switch. It is completely redesigned from the ground up, not in concept, but in technology, and it's an all-around better experience overall. It's significantly bigger, it's like 4 to 5 times more powerful, and there are so many quality of life improvements that make this a much easier console to use, to hold, and to play games on. The problem is, it just came out. It's very expensive, starting at $449, $500 if you want the Mario Kart bundle, which by the way I'm giving away, so make sure to stay tuned to learn how you can win that for yourself. But also, there's not really any specific games for it yet. There's Mario Kart World, but that's it. At launch, that is the only AAA first-party title available exclusively to the Switch 2. While sure, there are Switch 2 enhanced versions of a lot of different games, and you've got Nintendo Switch 2 Welcome Tour. Sort of. Mario Kart World is really the only brand new experience that you can have on the Switch 2. To you, maybe it seems very obvious which one that you should buy depending on your budget and also what kind of games you want to play. But for a lot of people, I don't think it is very obvious because the Switch 2 is new, it's powerful, and it's going to be around for probably 7 to 10 years. The Switch 1 has been around for 7 years, but it's significantly cheaper and it's got an amazing library of games. So if you're one of those people that somehow never ended up buying a Switch and you want to jump into that ecosystem, but you don't know which way to go, or maybe you have a Switch 1 and you're deciding whether you should upgrade, this is the video for you. Really quick though, before I forget, I am giving away a Nintendo Switch 2 Mario Kart bundle, so if you want the chance to win that for yourself, or the chance to enter to win that for yourself, make sure to click the link in the top of the description below and get the 3rd core badge. You need all 3 in order to enter to win this giveaway for yourself. The first 2 badges are available through previous Nintendo Switch videos that I've dropped on my channel, so make sure to redeem those as well. But definitely don't forget to redeem the badge if you haven't yet, and check out Core. Core is a great way to connect with your favorite creators in new ways. And also you could win a Nintendo Switch 2, so that's a big plus. In today's video, I'm gonna go over all of the differences, the tech specs, and the experiences that I've had on both of these consoles and let you know which one I think is worth it in 2025 and also which one is worth it for your specific use case. So with that being said, let's just dive right into it. Let's start off with the Switch 1 because that's the one you're probably the most familiar with. So as of right now, there are tons of different versions of the Switch 1, but there are 3 main variants. There's the standard Switch, there's the Switch Lite, and there's the Switch OLED. The standard Switch is still sold, even though it's the oldest of all the models. It retails for $299 and it gives you the standard Switch experience. It comes with a 6.2-inch LCD display, 32 gigabytes of internal storage, and a custom Tegra processor. And funnily enough, even at the time back in 2017, the Switch was a somewhat underpowered system. But if you look back at Nintendo for the last couple decades, that's sort of the direction that they've leaned into. They've never been the cutting-edge company when it comes to new tech, at least not in the last couple decades, and these consoles have been focused more on gameplay experience than graphical performance. And that's been made very obvious with the previous Switch, and honestly, even with the Switch 2. But we'll get into that. Now, the feature that everyone knows and loves about the Switch is actually in the name, the fact that it can switch from a handheld console to something that you dock and play on your TV. Back in 2017, that was an incredibly novel concept and something that no other company had really done successfully, at least not to the success level of Nintendo. The Switch 1 is one of the best-selling consoles of all time because it covers 2 big markets and it allows you to play handheld games on your TV and console-quality games on your handheld. And what's so cool is that they took a lot of their learnings from previous consoles like the Wii and even the Wii U and integrated all of these motion controls and fun aspects of those consoles into the Switch. So the console basically comes with 2 Wiimotes that are attached to your console that you can pull off and play like this, whether it's on your table or on your TV. And then if you want to travel with it and play it like a Game Boy, pull it out of the dock, you're good to go. So even though this console is not powerful at all by today's standards, or at least not very powerful by today's standards, it still provides a very unique gaming experience and allows you to play games anywhere. Now, like I mentioned, the original Switch comes in at $299 and it's solid. It's a great way to dive in. However, there are other options. The next option is the Switch Lite. Now, the Switch Lite kind of removes the main aspect that makes the Switch and is a console that is only playable in handheld mode. You no longer have removable controllers, you can no longer dock it to your TV, but it's smaller and more portable. And of course, it can play all of the Nintendo Switch games that don't require motion controls. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you can actually connect regular Joy-Cons to the Switch Lite and play motion games that way, but generally the main use case of the Switch Lite is to be a new Game Boy or a new Nintendo DS with one screen, so Nintendo S. Now, the Switch Lite is the cheapest of all of the Nintendo Switch consoles, but again, you lose a lot of functionality. However, if you don't ever plan to play in docked mode, or maybe you want to buy something for your kids to play on their next trip, then it's a really good way to go. And again, it can play all of the Switch games because there's a huge Switch library, which is pretty incredible. Now, in my opinion, the ultimate Switch one is the Switch OLED. This released back in 2021 and currently retails for $350. So this console retails for $50 more than the standard Switch. However, for that extra $50, you get a 7-inch display versus a 6.2-inch display. It's an OLED display, which means the colors are bright and vibrant, and you also get amazing contrast. This is truly one of the best, if not the best displays that you can get on any handheld console. It's only rivaled by maybe the Steam Deck. And it's actually, in my opinion, and a lot of people's opinions, better overall than the display on the Switch 2. However, the Switch 2 has a bigger display, it's very bright. We'll get into that. But honestly, in terms of technology and color and contrast, this is the best. Now, not only did the display on the Switch OLED get better, they also doubled the internal storage size from 32 gigabytes to 64 gigabytes. Now, to be fair, that's still a very small amount of storage, and while yes, Nintendo is pretty good about compressing their games to where they're not oversized like, games on PS5 and Xbox Series where it's like 100 and something gigs, Nintendo's pretty good about keeping them very low, like in the tens of gigs, so you can fit a couple digital games on here without an SD card, but generally, if you're playing a Nintendo Switch and you download any digital games, you're gonna want to get a micro SD card to expand your storage, which you can do up to 2 terabytes. In my Switch OLED, I actually have a 512 gigabyte micro SD card just to expand my storage, obviously, which is a big help, especially because I sort of play half and half when it comes to physical games versus digital games. And what's interesting about the Switch 1 is that this console came out sort of in the transitional period when people were going from physical games to digital games. And while there are still a lot of physical games available, nowadays, especially when it comes to the Switch 2, a lot of them are just download cards. You plug them in, it starts to download for you, and that's that. So in today's very digital world, if you are buying an original Nintendo Switch, I would recommend buying a micro SD card unless you are purely planning to go all physical games. The good news is micro SD cards, at least the ones that you use in the Nintendo Switch, are relatively inexpensive. We'll talk about these slightly more expensive micro SD cards that you have to use in the Switch 2 in a little bit. Now, there's one other aspect that the Switch 1 actually beats the Switch 2 besides the Switch OLED screen, and that's battery life. All of the Switch 1 consoles, maybe because they're less powerful or maybe they're just more efficient when it comes to power usage, have better battery life than the Switch 2. Generally, for AAA games, you can get 3.5 to 4 hours, and for less intense games, you can probably get like 6 hours. So you get a really decent battery life, especially for traveling with any of the Switch consoles. So if you're buying a Switch specifically to travel and you're going like overseas a lot or something like that, the Switch 1 might be the best option if you don't have somewhere to plug in your console because you get the best battery life. But now let's talk about the brand new Nintendo Switch 2. So this console comes in one variant currently, at least one console variant. It comes in at a retail price, like I mentioned, of $449, $500 for the Mario Kart bundle, but this is the only option that you can go with currently. However, for that money, you are getting a console that is 4 to 5 times more powerful than the Nintendo Switch 1. And because it's backwards compatible, you can play all of your Switch 1 games smoother and probably with higher frame rates than you could on the original Switch 1. So if you already have a huge Switch library, you're good to go. You've already got a bunch of games for your Switch 2. Now, when it comes to the processor, Nintendo continued to work with NVIDIA and went with a custom NVIDIA chip. I don't know all the details, but from what I've heard, it is comparable to a 1050 Ti, which for a small handheld, basically tablet, is pretty impressive. But generally, my experience with the Switch 2 versus something like the Steam Deck OLED on games that work on both has been better on the Switch 2. The graphics generally are better. It's a smoother experience. Now, we're still talking about like medium to low settings for games like Cyberpunk and other higher end games, but they run smoother on this versus this, and it's sort of noticeable. And the graphics look better on this, which is kind of wild. Now, something to keep in mind is that while right now, at the time of this releasing in June 2025, graphics are on par with some of the mid-level PC gaming handhelds, I can guarantee you in a year, this thing's gonna be outclassed by probably the Steam Deck 2, by any of the new Ally X's or anything like that. It's up to snuff now, but in a year, we're gonna be back to regular Nintendo, lower end graphics, but great gameplay. However, compared to the original Switch, it is a pretty impressive improvement. Another big improvement on the Switch 2 is actually the internal storage size. Rather than the 32 or 64 gigabytes you get on the Switch 1, you actually get 256 gigabytes standard. Now, to be fair, I think for a lot of people, including myself, the Switch 2 will be generally a digital first console, so you are gonna download most of your games. And you can't fit a huge amount of games on 256 gigabytes, realistically. Before I bought my micro SD card Express, I probably had 8-ish games on here. Some were huge, some were, regular size. So I was able to fit like Mario Kart World, one of the Zeldas. Cyberpunk didn't fit. Well, it's probably because I filled it up with some other stuff, but a lot of games on here, but it wasn't, it wasn't every game in my collection. Now, what Nintendo has done to sort of remedy this is give you expandable storage in the form of a micro SD Express card. Now, it's important to note that you cannot use a standard micro SD card in the Switch 2. It has to be micro SD Express. And And the reason for that is because it's only compatible with the Express one. I mean, that's kind of the obvious one. However, the Express card is significantly faster, so running games off of it is a better overall experience. And while yes, it's annoying because they're more expensive and there's not a huge amount of storage sizes currently available, it's a much better gameplay experience, and I think it's worth a couple extra bucks, or in this case, you know, the good amount of extra bucks. It's like $60 for the 256. The good news is though, as time progresses, micro SD Express cards will get cheaper, you'll get larger card sizes, and things are gonna be okay. But right now, as an early adopter, things can be pricey. To be fair though, anytime you early adopt any kind of tech, it's usually a pricier thing than waiting a couple years. Now, kind of backtracking a bit to performance, the Switch 2 actually comes with 12 gigabytes of RAM, which makes this a pretty fast handheld. Not only that, because the dock compared to the old dock is now actively cooled, meaning there's a fan in there, you can actually get a performance bump by playing this thing in docked mode. The Switch 2 actually runs better in the dock than it does in handheld mode, mainly because of the active cooling and you're getting constant power, which generally means it can run at higher clock speeds, which means that you can go from playing games at 1080p on your 1080p screen on the Switch 2 to playing games at full 4K resolution on your actual TV, which is pretty amazing. Now, while you don't really get a performance boost when you dock your Switch 1, you can play games at 1080p on your display because you actually probably have a 1080p or 4K TV, so it allows you to play games at that resolution. But if you're playing purely handheld, it's 720p. You couldn't play any kind of 4K on the Switch 1 at all. In fact, let's talk about the screen differences right now. So I already went over how great the Switch OLED display looks, but I haven't mentioned the resolution. The resolution of all of the Switches, the previous Switches, was 720p. The Switch 2 comes with a 7.9-inch display, which is almost 8 inches, significantly bigger than any of the Switch 1's displays. The display is a 1080p 120Hz capable display with VRR and HDR10. So in almost every single aspect, this LCD display is better than both the OLED and the original display. That said, OLED displays in general usually have better color accuracy, better contrast, and for some people just they consider it to look better. However, when it comes to gameplay, if you're more worried about your frame rates and you want a slightly higher resolution, the Switch 2 display is probably the way you should go. But for those people out there who are like, nah, OLED displays are always better. Yes, technically OLED displays are better, but FPS wise, you want to go with the Switch 2. Now, like I mentioned before, when you dock the Switch 2, you can actually get up to 4K resolution natively on the console to your TV, which is amazing. However, that's capped at 60 frames per second, so keep that in mind. But because of the extra power, you can pump out a lot more pixels and a lot higher frame rate on the Switch 2. Now, one thing that the Switch 1 has leaps and bounds ahead of the Switch 2 is battery life. The Switch 2, when playing higher end games, really kind of caps out at 2 to 2.5 hours. When I was playing Mario Kart World and Cyberpunk, I would get about 2.5 hours. Now, of course, like the Switch 2, if you're playing lower end games like retro games or something like that, you can get a lot longer battery life, like 4.5 to 5 hours, depending on the game. But generally, for those sort of higher end AAA games, 2.5 hours. So if you're traveling, then yeah, you probably want to have an outlet handy or a battery handy because you're not going to be playing this for as long as you probably would like. But those are all the tech specs out of the way. Why don't we talk about some of the major physical changes to the console? So the Switch 1 became popular because of its removable and switchable gameplay modes, which is really cool. The Switch 1 OLED also fixed a big problem of the original Switch by adding a much better stand. The original Switch had this little like finger that popped off all the time and barely worked. The Switch OLED gives you a variable stand that is significantly more secure and doesn't fall over. The original Switch controllers, as I'm sure you know, because I'm sure even if you don't own a Switch, you probably have played them, are pretty small and have these dinky little shoulder buttons. So when you're playing games like Mario Party that require you to hold the controller like this, it's not the most pleasant experience when you have to click these buttons. So in my opinion, that was the biggest physical improvement between the Switch 1 to the Switch 2. The controllers got significantly larger, the shoulder buttons got better, it's a lot easier to hold, the buttons are larger, and big improvement is the joysticks. So as you may or may not have heard, the Switch 1 kind of struggles with the issue of stick drift, which means that over time, these joysticks eventually wear out and they don't always register correctly. Meaning, as I'm sure you've seen on older consoles like the N64 with their joystick, when you have the joystick kind of set to standard neutral mode, the cursor or whatever the thing is, the pointer, slowly drifts off on the screen and you're not doing anything. It's just purely because the sensor thinks that you're moving it, but you're not. And that's because the sensor has been worn out over time. That has been a problem that has plagued the Switch 1 because whatever kind of sensors they were using inside the Switch, they wore out very quickly and people would experience stick drift a lot. Now, according to Nintendo, these joysticks are not only smoother than the original Switch 1, but they're also a lot less susceptible to stick drift. That being said, I'm sure it is still going to be a problem. Joysticks always wear out. They're never going to be perfect, so I wouldn't be surprised if these still eventually get that, but it might be a lot later in their lifespan than the original Switch. However, if you're not worried about that and you're just going to buy more Joy-Cons in the future, which is expensive, but it is doable, I mean, overall, these controllers are a massive improvement. The shoulder buttons are like 6 times the size of the original shoulder buttons. The joystick feels amazing. You've got a new chat button. The actual face buttons are bigger, which is a huge plus, and the Joy-Cons are now magnetic, which is super cool. The old ones were obviously on a rail system, which was fine, but one thing you'll notice when you're holding both of these consoles in hand is that the Switch 1, kind of wobbly, there's definitely some play in between the Joy-Cons and the console, whereas on the Switch 2, because of the way that they're magnetically attached and the fact that there's more of the Joy-Con kind of inside the console, it's a very secure and firm hold. Plus, the magnets that are used are incredibly strong. Another big improvement is the way that you remove the Joy-Cons. On the original Nintendo Nintendo Switch 1, you have these tiny little dinky buttons. You click them, slide up. On the Switch 2, you've got these pretty large and surprisingly unobtrusive like trigger buttons that you squeeze and they pop off like that. Now you can, if you really pull, I'm genuinely like, there we go. You can actually remove these without clicking the trigger, but it's not easy. Another improvement, which I haven't touched on, but in addition to all the improvements that I've already talked about, is that you can now use the Joy-Cons as mice, which you probably will never do, but it is an option. There's a little optical sensor right there, so when you add the attachment, I'm using the wrong color here because I can't reach the red one, but you can add the little wrist strap attachment and it raises it off the ground so the optical sensor works and you can use it as a mouse, which is really cool. And because you can use it as a mouse, they've actually increased the sizes of the R, ZR, ZL, and L buttons to actually wrap around the side of the controller, which not only makes them more comfortable, but also you can click them from the top in mouse mode, which is very cool. Now again, I don't see myself really using mouse mode for anything other than Civilization, which is what I've been using it for, which is actually pretty nice. I will say that a standard mouse does feel better, but if you're in a pinch and you don't want to get a mouse for your Switch, you already have one. So all around, the Switch 2 Joy-Cons are a huge improvement over the Switch 1 Joy-Cons. They also have HD Rumble 2, which is a slightly more, impressive rumble feature than the Switch 1, although the Switch 1's rumble was already amazing. You have to experience it to understand it. It is very precise and it can make you feel like you're holding a box with a ball in it and rolling it around. If you've ever played the Switch, you've probably experienced it. Nintendo's always had really great rumble features in their consoles, and it's no different on either the Switch 1 or the Switch 2. Some other really nice quality of life improvements is that Nintendo's actually added a second USB-C port on the top of the console itself, so you can charge either on the top or on the bottom, depending on what you want to do. You can plug in 2 accessories at once. A lot of things are now available to you because you have a second USB-C port, which I really, really like. Some smaller changes are the way that you actually open the game cart slot. On the Switch 2, they open on the back. On the Switch 1, they open on the front. Not really a big deal. The stand is still really great on the Switch 2. It's not as beefy as it was on the Switch 1, but it's just as usable and functional, and it's just as stable. In terms of connectivity on the dock, both docks come with USB-C power, HDMI out, and a LAN port or an Ethernet port. And then on the outside, you have 2 USB Type-A ports on both of them. For some reason, the Switch 2 doesn't come with USB Type-C ports on the outside, which baffles me, but any of the accessories that you buy will come with the USB-C end and USB Type-A end, so you can plug them into the dock. Still wish it was all USB-C, but whatever. The Switch 2 still has a 3.5mm headphone jack like the Switch 1, so that's great. However, the Switch 2 now comes with Bluetooth enabled out of the box. The Switch 1, initially, you couldn't connect Bluetooth headphones. With the Switch 2, you're good to go from the get. Obviously, you've got Wi-Fi 6 on the Switch 2, which wasn't really a standard on the Switch 1, so there you go. There's a lot of small technological improvements which kind of keep the console relevant and modern with the times and with all the modern connectivity standards, things like that. So in a lot of ways, the Switch 2 isn't trying to reinvent the wheel. The Switch 2 is just the next generation of the Switch 1, in the same way that the PS5 is the next generation of the PS4. It's not like going from the Nintendo GameCube to the Nintendo Wii, where it's a whole new playstyle. The closest thing that you have to that, I guess, is the mouse mode, but I don't think that's going to be that serious of a feature for a lot of people. Overall, this is more of a power jump and a quality of life jump. Everything about the Switch 2, in my opinion, almost everything, except for battery life and I guess the screen quality, when you talk about the OLED, is better on the Switch 2 than on the Switch 1. That being said, the price is not. This console is about $100 to $150 more expensive and a lot harder to find than any variant of the Switch 1. Even the OLED. The OLED comes in at $350. You're probably going to start being able to find it on sale because they're trying to move units. So right now, it's $100 cheaper than the Switch 2 if you go for just the Switch 2 console itself, not the Mario bundle. And the Switch original version is $150 cheaper, and Switch Lite, right there is what, $250 cheaper? Yeah, $250. $300 if you get the Mario Kart bundle. Something else I should mention is that the price of games has also increased on the Switch 2. It's increased from the regular $60 to now $80 for first-party games. So that is a huge bummer, and it seems like that's going to become an industry standard across the board. So because of that, the general cost of ownership of the Switch 2 is going to be more than the Switch 1. So everything that I've said kind of culminates at this point right now, where I'm going to tell you guys which one I think you should get personally. If you are looking for the top of the line, best Switch available, the Switch 2 is the way to go. Now, yes, the battery life isn't as good, and yes, it's not an OLED display, but every other aspect of the Switch 2, in my opinion, is better than the Switch 1. That being said, if you just want to play some great Nintendo games and you don't really care about having the newest piece of tech, now is still not a bad time to buy the Switch 1, because while yes, this is the older generation, they're still releasing games on the Switch 1, and they will for a little while. Plus, there is a massive backlog of games from the last 10 years that you can play on the Switch 1. So if you're trying to buy a console right now to travel with or just play games with and you don't care about having the newest thing, the Switch 1 is a great way to go. Now, I would recommend specifically grabbing the OLED version if you are going to buy a new Switch 1 and you're planning to play in both docked mode and in handheld mode, but you're also fine getting the original Switch as well. The one Switch that I would personally stay away from would be the Switch Lite, just because you can't dock it and it doesn't have motion controls. But again, if you're buying it for a younger child or someone who only wants to play Switch 1 games in handheld mode, that's also fine. It's also the cheapest version, so it's the cheapest buy-in. Now, with that being said, is the Switch 1 still worth buying in 2025? In my opinion, especially if you can get it on sale, absolutely yes. It is a great console for a great price. price. The games are cheaper. There's a lot of games on sale now, and there's a huge catalog of games. It's not the most powerful, and it's not going to be supported, in 5 years from now, but it is a great console to have right now if you just want to play games right now. Now, if you're very future facing, you want to buy the newest thing, and you want to have something that will last for years and years and years and be supported for years and years and years, yes, go for the Switch 2, but good luck finding one right now. And you got to save up because these games are expensive. But hey, even if you're buying the Switch 2 just to play Switch 1 games, you're going to get a better, smoother overall experience playing on the Switch 2 versus the Switch 1. They're still very playable on the Switch 1, but the Switch 2 is going to be the best way to play them. Now, if you're someone who already has the Switch 1, in my opinion, there's no reason to upgrade right now unless you really want to. Now, to be fair, I don't think the price of the Switch 2 is going to drop anytime soon. I think we're talking years from now before there's any kind of sale on the Switch 2. So don't think that you're going to wait until the holidays or until next year and be able to buy a Switch 2 at a discount. You're probably not. You could probably buy a used one, but that's about it. I think if you're content with your Switch 1, wait it out until you feel like you need to upgrade or until there are enough games on the Switch 2 to make the Switch worth it for you. But hey, if you made it to this point in the video, let me know your thoughts on the Switch 1 and the Switch 2 in the comment section down below. Do you have a Switch 2 yet? Are you going to upgrade to the Switch 2 or are you just going to buy a Switch 1? Let me know all of those thoughts down below. If you want the chance to win a brand new Nintendo Switch 2 Mario Kart bundle for yourself, make sure to check out the latest core badge, which again is linked in the description below. That's core badge 3. It is the last badge that you need, and then you get the completion badge, and then you're entered, you're all good to go. So check that out if you want the chance to win one for yourself so you don't have to spend all the money on it. And with that being said, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't yet, and I'll see you all in the next one.